Imagine a small town in Louisiana in the spring of 1873. The air is warm, the sun casts long shadows across the rolling hills, and the courthouse in Colfax stands at the center of a community brimming with cautious hope. On the surface, life seems almost picturesque, but beneath that serene exterior, tensions are simmering. This is a story of courage, injustice, and the fight for equality, a story that has been hidden for far too long. The Colfax Massacre, which took place in this seemingly quiet town, was not just a tragic incident. It was a defining moment that revealed the fragility of democracy and the dangerous lengths some would go to maintain power. The year 1873 was part of the Reconstruction Era, a time when the United States was grappling with the aftermath of the Civil War. Newly freed black citizens were striving to claim the rights promised to them by the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. They voted, ran for office, and tried to participate fully in society, but their efforts were met with fierce resistance from those who wished to preserve the old social order. In Colfax, this struggle came to a head. The town became a battleground where the fight for justice clashed with entrenched prejudice. The courthouse, a modest wooden building, transformed into a symbol of both hope and defiance. Here, black citizens gathered to protect their elected officials and assert their political rights, standing against a tide of intimidation and violence. Little did they know that this stand would spark one of the bloodiest episodes in the Reconstruction South, leaving an indelible mark on history. As we explore this story, we will uncover not only the events that led to the massacre, but also the personal courage, strategic decisions, and human experiences that shaped this day. From the tense standoff at the courthouse to the devastating aftermath, the Colfax Massacre teaches us lessons about resilience, community, and the ongoing struggle for justice. It reminds us that the fight for equality has never been easy, and that progress often comes at a high cost. If you are passionate about understanding history and uncovering stories that are often overlooked, stay with us. In this video, we will reveal the hidden truths of the Colfax Massacre, explore its impact on American society, and reflect on what it teaches us about democracy and civil rights today. Do not forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode of history that matters. Join us on this journey into the past, as we shine a light on a story that is both heartbreaking and essential, because understanding history is the first step toward creating a better future. As the warm Louisiana sun rose over Colfax in the spring of 1873, the town seemed to hum with the quiet rhythm of daily life. Yet beneath this calm surface, profound struggle was unfolding, one that would come to define the precarious state of freedom and justice in the post-Civil War South. The Reconstruction Era promised a new beginning, especially for black citizens who had endured centuries of bondage. And now, newly freed, they were determined to carve out a place for themselves in the political landscape that had long excluded them. Voting, holding office, owning land, and participating in local governance were not merely privileges but powerful acts of defiance, symbols of a broader hope that equality could finally take root in a society that had been structured to deny it. In Colfax, this hope was tangible. The courthouse stood as more than just a building, it was a beacon of possibility, a place where black citizens could assert their rights, protect their elected officials, and exercise the democratic freedoms they had been promised. Yet the assertion of these rights did not go unchallenged. White supremacists, many of whom had once fought to uphold the Confederacy, viewed the emergence of black political power as a direct threat to the established social hierarchy. Their opposition was neither subtle nor restrained. It was a determined and often violent campaign aimed at reclaiming dominance and suppressing any challenge to their authority. Across the South, from small towns to larger parishes, armed militias formed with the explicit purpose of intimidating, attacking, and ultimately erasing the gains that black communities had achieved during Reconstruction. These groups, often operating with tacit support or deliberate inaction from local law enforcement, wielded power with impunity, using fear as a tool to control and manipulate, ensuring that the promise of equality remained, for many, a distant dream rather than a lived reality. In Colfax, the tension between these two forces, the newly empowered black citizens and the entrenched white supremacist militias, was brought into stark relief. Black citizens, acutely aware of the history of racial violence and the precarious nature of their newfound freedoms, organized and armed themselves to protect both their lives and their political representation. Led by figures such as Militia Captain William Ward, a Union Army veteran, they fortified the courthouse, understanding that this modest wooden structure had come to symbolize much more than governance. It embodied resilience, dignity, and the assertion of a rightful place in a society that had long denied them voice and power. Every plank of wood, every barricade, every rifle held by the defenders was a statement that they would not be passively erased or intimidated. The stakes were immeasurably high, for this stand was not just about a single building or election, it was about the possibility of a future where black citizens could exercise their rights freely without fear of retaliation. Meanwhile, white supremacist forces gathered with calculated precision, interpreting the courthouse occupation as an intolerable challenge to the social order they sought to maintain. Militia leaders rallied men from neighboring parishes, invoking the rhetoric of law, order, and the preservation of tradition, though their true intent was far more sinister: to terrorize, subjugate, and, if necessary, annihilate the community that dared to stand against them. The stage was set for confrontation, a collision not merely of factions but of ideologies, where the belief in equality would meet the unyielding force of violent resistance. Every whispered rumor, every movement of reinforcements, heightened the tension, creating a palpable sense of inevitability, a dread that the fragile promise of reconstruction might be violently undone before the eyes of a community that had dared to dream. As the days passed leading up to April 13th, the courthouse became a microcosm of the broader national struggle. Inside, black defenders maintained vigilance, aware that any lapse could be fatal, while outside, the white militias prepared, amassing weapons and numbers with meticulous attention to detail. The air between these two forces was thick with anticipation, each aware that the forthcoming confrontation would not simply decide the outcome of a local dispute, but would send ripples across the Reconstruction South, signaling either the potential permanence of black political agency or the brutal reformation of white supremacy. In this tense atmosphere, courage and fear were intertwined. Those inside the courthouse understood the personal risk of their resistance, yet they remained committed to the principle that their rights could not be surrendered quietly. In doing, they personified the profound struggle of an entire generation seeking recognition, equality, and dignity in the face of systemic oppression. The Colfax Massacre that would soon unfold was the tragic culmination of this tense struggle, a violent eruption that illustrated the lengths to which those invested in preserving racial hierarchy were willing to go. It was not merely an isolated act of brutality. It was a deliberate and organized effort to crush hope and assert dominance. A stark reminder that political rights without protection could be fleeting. The defenders' stand, however, also left an enduring legacy of courage, showing that even in the most desperate circumstances, individuals and communities could rise to assert their humanity and demand justice. Their story serves as a poignant reminder that the fight for equality has always been met with resistance, that the path toward civil rights is often perilous, and that the struggle for recognition, representation, and respect is a continuous one that echoes across generations. In connecting the broader historical context to the personal bravery of those who stood in the Colfax courthouse, we see the profound tension between hope and oppression, courage and cruelty, and the complex realities of a nation attempting to reconcile its ideals with the stark legacy of its past. The events in Colfax remind us that democracy and equality are never guaranteed. They are achievements that must be actively defended, nurtured, and protected. And that understanding history is essential to ensuring that the sacrifices of those who fought for justice are not forgotten but serve as guiding lights for future generations seeking a fairer, more just society. In the early months of 1873, the small town of Colfax, Louisiana, already simmering with the delicate tension of Reconstruction, found itself at the center of a storm fueled by political dispute and deep-seated racial animosity. A storm whose origins could be traced back to the controversial gubernatorial election of 1872. Across Louisiana, the results of this election had been hotly contested, with both Republican and Democratic candidates claiming victory amid accusations of fraud, intimidation, and manipulation. In Grarish, where the population was predominantly black, these tensions were not abstract debates in distant offices but immediate, tangible pressures felt by families, neighbors, and local leaders who understood that the outcome of this political battle could shape their very survival, their access to justice, and the recognition of their rights in a society still clinging to the hierarchies of the antebellum South. The Republican candidate, William Pitt Kellogg, represented the party of Reconstruction and the promise of black political empowerment, while his Democratic opponent, John Sinnery, drew support from those determined to restore pro-war social dominance. The stakes were extraordinarily high in Grant Parish because the black majority, newly enfranchised, had begun to exercise political influence through the ballot, filling local offices with leaders who reflected their community's interests and aspirations. For those who had been denied agency for generations, these victories were not merely symbolic, they were tangible affirmations of dignity, progress, and the possibility of a society in which their voices could no longer be ignored or silenced. Yet, for many white residents and militia leaders, these shifts in power were perceived not as the natural evolution of democracy, but as an existential threat to the social order they had long controlled, a challenge that could not be tolerated without retaliation. Rumors of tampering and fraud inflamed tempers on both sides. But it was the very presence of black political power that most alarmed those determined to preserve white supremacy. Meetings in local homes and churches, whispered conversations in the streets, and the sudden mobilization of militias all reflected a community teetering on the edge of violence. Tensions escalated as both parties sought to assert their claim to authority, with each new declaration of victory by one side prompting counterclaims and ultimatums by the other. In Grarish, where black citizens formed the majority, the Republican victory meant more than control of offices. It was a statement of the emerging political reality in the South, one that directly challenged decades of oppression and social exclusion. The response from white supremacist groups was swift and brutal, as militias formed to intimidate voters, disrupt political meetings, and, if necessary, use force to reverse the results that threatened their vision of a hierarchical society. As political discourse gave way to armed posturing, the courthouse in Colfax became the symbolic and literal focal point of the conflict. This modest structure, normally a place for legal proceedings and civic administration, transformed into a stronghold for those determined to protect the legitimacy of the Republican-led local government. Black citizens, aware of the history of violence and the systematic efforts to suppress their newly acquired rights, took up positions within the courthouse under the leadership of organized militia captains who had served in the Union Army. They fortified the building as best they could, aware that the eyes of the nation, though distant, were observing whether the promises of Reconstruction would endure or be violently undone by those unwilling to accept change. Outside, tensions mounted as white militias began to gather from surrounding parishes, interpreting the occupation of the courthouse not as a defensive measure but as an affront, a rebellion against the social and political hierarchy they sought to protect. With careful coordination, these groups assembled men, weapons, and logistical support, framing their mission as one of restoring order, while concealing the underlying motive of suppressing black political agency. Each day the standoff continued. The atmosphere thickened with fear and anticipation. Neighbors watched. Families whispered warnings, and the sense of inevitability grew that a confrontation of historic magnitude was imminent. The disputed election had transformed abstract political conflict into an immediate, life-and-death struggle. Where the courthouse represented more than a seat of government, it embodied the principle that democracy could either protect the rights of all citizens or collapse under the weight of prejudice and violence. Inside, the black defenders understood the stakes with haunting clarity. Their presence was a stand for justice, not aggression, a defense of legal authority and personal dignity in a world where both were too often denied. They knew that surrender could mean death, that leaving the courthouse would invite chaos and retribution against their families. And yet they remained resolute, fortified by their commitment to principles that extended far beyond the walls of the building. Meanwhile, every act of preparation outside, reinforcements arriving, rifles being cleaned, plans being whispered, served to heighten the tension, setting the stage for a confrontation that would not only determine the outcome of a local election, but also send ripples through the South, influencing perceptions of Reconstruction and the fragile promise of equality. The disputed gubernatorial election of 1872 thus served as the catalyst for a broader and more devastating conflict, exposing the deep fractures in Louisiana's social and political fabric. It illuminated the fragility of newly won rights in the face of determined opposition, and revealed the extent to which those invested in maintaining white supremacy would go to reclaim control. In the quiet moments before the violence erupted, the courthouse in Colfax symbolized both hope and defiance, standing as a testament to the courage of those who sought to exercise their rights in a world resistant to change. The struggle over political power, intertwined with racial tension, would soon explode into one of the most tragic and consequential events of the Reconstruction era, leaving a legacy that continues to teach the vital importance of vigilance, civic engagement, and the defense of equality in the face of entrenched opposition. This moment, born from the complexities of a contested election, reminds us that political victories are never guaranteed and that the fight for representation, justice, and the recognition of human dignity requires both courage and resilience, especially when met with fierce resistance from those unwilling to accept the evolution of society toward fairness and inclusion. As the political storm in Louisiana reached its boiling point in the spring of 1873, Colfax became a tense microcosm of the broader struggle unfolding across the Reconstruction South, where the promise of freedom and equality collided with the unyielding resistance of entrenched white supremacy. In this predominantly black parish, the stakes were extraordinary. The outcome of local governance would determine whether newly enfranchised black citizens could exercise their rights without fear, or whether the social hierarchy of the antebellum South would be violently reasserted. Both sides understood the gravity of the moment, and as tensions escalated, preparations for conflict became increasingly tangible. White militias, composed largely of former Confederate soldiers and men determined to restore the pre-war social order, began to organize with a deliberate focus on suppressing black political influence. Their presence was not incidental, nor was it merely symbolic. It was a calculated response to the challenge posed by a population asserting its newly recognized legal and political rights. These militias moved with precision, gathering arms, coordinating strategies, and recruiting men from surrounding parishes under the banner of maintaining law and order. though their true aim was the preservation of racial hierarchy. Their training, experience from the war, and collective knowledge of the terrain gave them a chilling advantage, and they believed, with stark certainty, that the assertion of black political power represented an existential threat to the society they had long controlled. Every movement, every whispered plan, and every rifle carefully prepared in these camps of white supremacists contributed to a sense of impending confrontation that hung over Colfax like a dark cloud, foreshadowing the violent events that would soon engulf the town. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere was no less charged. Black citizens, fully aware of the historical pattern of intimidation and violence against their communities, did not approach their defense lightly. Many had witnessed or heard stories of attacks on their neighbors in parishes across Louisiana, and they knew that the right to vote and hold office, while legally guaranteed, could not be assumed to be safe without vigilance. Led by Militia Captain William Ward, a Union Army veteran, they fortified the courthouse, reinforcing windows and doors, stockpiling weapons, and organizing themselves to respond to potential attacks. Each person within those walls understood that their actions were both a practical necessity for survival and a profound statement of agency, a refusal to yield to threats that sought to erase the political and social gains of Reconstruction. The tension between the organized white militias and the defenders of the courthouse was palpable, creating a charged environment where the line between life and death was razor thin. Outside, the militias conducted drills, rehearsed coordinated movements, and sent messages to rally additional support, their numbers swelling with reinforcements from neighboring areas. Inside, the defenders prepared themselves mentally and physically for the likelihood of attack, rehearsing responses and ensuring that every man knew his role in protecting both the building and the symbolic power it represented. The courthouse, a modest wooden structure, became much more than a civic building. It transformed into a symbol of resistance, resilience, and the assertion of rights long denied. The approaching clash was not merely the result of random chance, but a direct consequence of a deeply polarized society in which legal rights could be enforced or ignored depending on the determination and capacity of those who sought to uphold them. The militias outside saw themselves as guardians of tradition, interpreters of a social order they believed was divinely and historically ordained, while those inside saw themselves as defenders of justice, equality, and the principle that law and morality should protect all citizens equally. Each side's perception of righteousness heightened the inevitability of confrontation, creating a situation in which compromise seemed impossible, and where the morality of defense versus aggression would be tested with devastating consequences. As the days passed, the siege mentality took hold on both sides. The white militias encircled the courthouse, cutting off supplies and observing movements, while inside, the black defenders remained vigilant, maintaining watches and preparing for the moment when confrontation might erupt. Fear, courage, and determination intertwined, shaping the behavior of all involved. The knowledge that surrender could result in death or enslavement created a heightened sense of resolve among the defenders, while the militias, emboldened by their numbers and past experiences in warfare, felt justified in their preparations for violence. This confrontation in Colfax, where white militias sought to suppress black political influence and black citizens armed themselves to defend their rights, was emblematic of the broader Reconstruction struggle. It demonstrated the precariousness of newly gained freedoms in the face of organized resistance, and the lengths to which individuals and groups would go to assert or deny political agency. It also highlighted the courage and determination of those who, despite the overwhelming odds, chose to stand firm in defense of principles that extended far beyond a single election or a single building. The courthouse became a microcosm of a nation grappling with the aftermath of slavery, the promises of Reconstruction, and the bitter realities of entrenched prejudice and systemic opposition. Ultimately, the events in Colfax serve as a poignant reminder of the complex dynamics of power, resistance, and survival during this era. The armed standoff between white militias and black defenders was more than a local dispute. It was a manifestation of the broader struggle for equality and justice, illustrating both the fragility of civil rights in the absence of protection and the extraordinary courage required to defend them. It is a story that echoes through history, revealing the human cost of societal transformation and the enduring importance of vigilance, resilience, and the unwavering commitment to uphold justice, even in the face of seemingly insurmountable opposition. Under the leadership of Militia Captain William Ward, a seasoned Union Army veteran, the Colfax Courthouse in the spring of 1873 transformed from a quiet center of local governance into a fortified bastion of resilience and defiance, where around 150 black gathered not merely to occupy a building, but to assert a claim to political legitimacy and personal dignity that had been denied for generations. Each man who entered the courthouse understood that this stand was about more than walls and wood. It was a declaration that the rights won through the struggle of Reconstruction would not be surrendered without resistance, a living embodiment of the hope that equality, however fragile, could take root in a society still grappling with the legacies of slavery and systemic oppression. Inside those modest wooden walls, the men prepared themselves for what they knew could become a violent confrontation. Fortifying doors, barricading windows, and organizing weapons, knowing that their presence alone challenged the expectations and fears of those determined to restore pro-war hierarchies. The courthouse, normally a space for quiet deliberation, hearings, and the exercise of civic duties, became a charged symbol of black agency, attracting the wary eyes of neighbors and the suspicious scrutiny of white supremacist militias assembling beyond its perimeter. For Ward and his men, every plank reinforced, every rifle checked, and every position assigned carried a profound weight of responsibility. They were not only defending a building or protecting elected officials. They were defending the idea that black citizens could participate in the governance of their communities without terror, coercion, or disenfranchisement, asserting a claim to a political space that had been systematically denied for decades. Their occupation was as much an act of psychological resistance as it was physical defense, sending a clear signal to their opponents that the assertion of rights would not be passive or symbolic but active, deliberate, and determined. Outside, the presence of the courthouse defenders was perceived not as a protective measure, but as a provocation, a tangible threat to the social and political dominance that white militias sought to maintain at all costs. These groups, composed largely of former Confederates and other white Southerners opposed to Reconstruction, interpreted the occupation as an affront to the natural order they believed they were entitled to enforce. They rallied men from neighboring parishes, stockpiled arms, and coordinated strategies for an impending assault, framing their mission as one of restoring law and order while masking the underlying motivation of preserving racial hierarchy. Each day, as reinforcements arrived and plans were refined, the tension between the fortified courthouse and the encircling militias grew, creating a palpable sense of impending conflict that hung over Colfax like a storm cloud, heavy with the possibility of violence. Inside, Ward's leadership was both practical and symbolic. He had served in the Union Army, witnessing the broader consequences of civil strife and understanding the stakes of organized resistance. He instilled discipline, assigned roles, and coordinated defense strategies, ensuring that each man knew his responsibility not only to protect the courthouse but to represent the broader aspirations of a community striving for recognition, equality, and justice. Every rifle, every barricade, and every watchful eye represented a commitment to safeguard not only themselves, but the principles of political participation that had been hard-won through Reconstruction legislation. They understood the historical significance of their stand, aware that the nation was watching, if distantly, and that the outcome would resonate far beyond the walls of their small parish courthouse. The physical act of occupying the courthouse intertwined with a profound sense of purpose and courage. For many of the defenders, the building was a sanctuary where they could assert authority in a world that had long sought to deny them voice and agency. It was a space where political rights were more than words on paper, they were actions carried out through vigilance, organization, and the willingness to confront immediate threats to life and liberty. Each man's presence within those walls embodied the larger struggle of black citizens across the South who, newly enfranchised, faced relentless opposition from those unwilling to accept the social and political transformations of the Reconstruction era. As the standoff intensified, the significance of the courthouse occupation became increasingly clear. It was a microcosm of the larger national struggle, where newly gained rights could be challenged, overturned, or defended with extraordinary consequence. Ward and his men were acutely aware that surrender might result in death, injury, or the collapse of the political gains they had fought to achieve, and yet they remained resolute, understanding that their defiance carried meaning beyond immediate survival. Their stand was both a protective measure and a declaration, a public affirmation that black citizens would not passively relinquish the political power that Reconstruction had briefly afforded them, and that the principles of democracy demanded active defense against those who would subvert them through violence and intimidation. Meanwhile, outside, the white militia's anticipation and preparation mirrored the determination inside the courthouse. The escalating standoff illustrated the stark reality of Reconstruction's fragility, where the enforcement of civil rights depended not only on laws, but on the courage and organization of those willing to risk everything to uphold them. The courthouse became a symbol of the tension between legal guarantees and social resistance, a physical and ideological battleground where the struggle for equality, dignity, and recognition would be tested with brutal immediacy. The occupation under Ward's command was more than a tactical maneuver. It was a historic act of defiance, demonstrating that black citizens were willing to defend their elected officials, their communities, and the very principles of representative governance, even in the face of overwhelming odds. It reflected the broader challenges of Reconstruction, highlighting both the potential for empowerment and the peril of entrenched opposition. The courage displayed in those tense days at the Colfax courthouse stands as a testament to the resilience, determination, and unwavering commitment of a people who understood that the fight for political rights required vigilance, unity, and the willingness to confront immediate threats, transforming a modest building into a symbol of hope, resistance, and the ongoing struggle for justice. As dawn broke over Colfax in the spring of 1873, the town awoke to an atmosphere thick with tension, an almost tangible anxiety that seemed to hang over every street and building. Yet nowhere was it more concentrated than around the modest wooden courthouse that had become the heart of the unfolding drama. Under the command of Militia Captain William Ward, approximately 150 black men had taken a stand, occupying the courthouse to protect elected officials and assert their hard-won political rights. Their presence a beacon of resilience and determination in a community that had long suffered under the shadow of systemic oppression. From outside, the response was swift, calculated, and chilling. White militias, composed largely of ex-Confederates and men determined to reassert the antebellum social hierarchy, began to converge upon the courthouse with purpose and precision. surrounding the building in a display of force that was meant to intimidate and subjugate rather than negotiate or reason. The surrounding militias were not haphazard in their actions. They moved strategically, cutting off supply routes and severing lines of communication, isolating the courthouse from any potential reinforcements or support. Every approach to the building was monitored, and every attempt to establish contact with the outside world was blocked or intercepted, creating a siege that was as much psychological as it was physical. The defenders inside the courthouse were acutely aware of the encirclement, sensing that the walls that protected them were also prison walls, trapping them between a commitment to their principles and the immediate threat of overwhelming force. Each man knew that surrender was not merely a tactical decision. It was a question of survival, a choice that could determine whether the gains of Reconstruction would be extinguished in an instant of violence. The white militia sent emissaries to demand surrender, framing their ultimatum as a measure of law and order. Yet the underlying motive was clear: to suppress the political influence of black citizens and restore the racial hierarchy that had been disrupted by the transformative legislation of the Reconstruction Era. These demands were repeated with increasing insistence, punctuated by the implicit and often explicit threat of force. The men inside the courthouse, seasoned by experience and guided by the leadership of Ward, understood the danger but refused to yield. Their resistance was grounded not in bravado, but in the sober understanding that capitulation would mean the loss of rights, the potential for death or injury, and the reinforcement of a societal structure that sought to deny them equality and agency. As the hours stretched, the standoff transformed into an almost theatrical tension, with the courthouse serving as the central stage where the confrontation between emerging civil rights and entrenched oppression would play out. The defenders maintained watches, reinforced barricades, and coordinated responses to any signs of aggression. While outside, the militias organized themselves, reinforcing positions, testing the resolve of the occupants, and preparing for what would inevitably become a violent clash. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation, a heavy silence punctuated by the distant sound of drills, shouted orders, and the occasional movement of supplies and men, each action signaling the inexorable march toward confrontation. Inside the courthouse, the men felt the weight of history pressing down upon them. They were not only defending their immediate lives and their fellow citizens, but also asserting the principle that political participation and civil rights were worth defending at all costs. Ward's leadership was critical, instilling discipline, ensuring strategic placement of defenders, and maintaining morale in the face of escalating threats. Every fortified window, every stacked chair used as a barricade, and every rifle kept ready represented a commitment to the larger cause of equality and a refusal to allow fear to dictate the outcome. Each man understood that their stand was symbolic as well as practical. They were demonstrating to the nation, if anyone was paying attention, that black citizens would not passively submit to intimidation or violence, and that the right to vote, to hold office, and to protect one's community required vigilance and courage. Meanwhile, the white militia's preparations grew more ominous with each passing hour. Reinforcements arrived, swelling their numbers and reinforcing the perception of inevitable confrontation. They tested the resolve of the courthouse defenders through taunts, displays of weaponry, and threats, all calculated to weaken morale and provoke surrender. The siege mentality on both sides created an almost unbearable tension, with every small movement interpreted as a signal, every sound as a potential threat, and every decision carrying profound consequences. The courthouse, ordinary in its construction and design, had become a crucible in which courage, fear, principle, and desperation were tested with unrelenting intensity. This encirclement and the demands for surrender highlighted the stark realities of Reconstruction Era Louisiana, where legal rights could be contested with force, and where the ability of black citizens to protect themselves and their communities was continually challenged by organized opposition. The siege was a microcosm of the broader struggle for equality in the post-Civil War South, illustrating how the assertion of rights could provoke violent backlash, how courage could be met with aggression, and how the principles of justice and democracy were fragile when confronted with entrenched social hierarchies willing to employ intimidation and force. As the day wore on, it became increasingly clear that the standoff was approaching its breaking point, that the defensive actions of the black citizens and the aggressive posturing of the white militias could no longer coexist without eruption. Every passing hour heightened the stakes, sharpened the awareness of danger, and intensified the emotional and psychological strain on those inside the courthouse. The siege was no longer merely a strategic maneuver. It had become a defining moment of confrontation between the promises of reconstruction and the violent realities of resistance. A moment in which courage, principle, and determination would be tested against the overwhelming force of a society unwilling to relinquish its long-held dominance. Ultimately, the surrounding of the courthouse, the severing of supplies and communication, and the persistent demands for surrender created a situation in which conflict was almost inevitable. The events at Colfax that day stand as a stark illustration of the fragility of civil rights in the Reconstruction South, the extraordinary courage required to defend them, and the devastating consequences that could follow when determination met unrelenting opposition. It is a story of vigilance, resilience, and the profound human cost of standing firm in defense of principle. A narrative that continues to resonate as a powerful reminder of the stakes involved when justice, equality, and freedom are challenged by force and intimidation. The morning of April 13, 1873, dawned over Colfax with an eerie calm that belied the storm about to break, as the small Louisiana town seemed suspended in a tense silence that carried the weight of history, fear, and expectation. The standoff that had been building for days around the modest wooden courthouse, where approximately 150 black men under the command of Militia Captain William Ward had taken a stand to defend elected officials and assert their political rights, reached its tragic climax in a way that would leave an indelible mark on American history, revealing the depth of racial animosity, the fragility of civil protections, and the extreme lengths to which white supremacist forces would go to maintain dominance. Inside the courthouse, the defenders were acutely aware of the danger encroaching upon them. For days they had fortified doors, barricaded windows, and organized weapons. Yet the knowledge that the encircling militias now numbered in the hundreds and were prepared for violent confrontation heightened the tension to an almost unbearable level. The men understood that their stand was about more than survival. It was about the defense of political representation, community, and dignity, and every choice they made within those walls carried immense consequence, not only for themselves but for the broader struggle for civil rights in the post-Civil War South. The courthouse had become more than a structure of wood and nails. It was a symbol of resistance, a tangible assertion that black citizens would not yield to intimidation or violence even in the face of overwhelming odds. As the standoff reached its zenith, white militias moved decisively, cutting off all remaining access to supplies and communication and surrounding the courthouse in a menacing formation designed to project absolute control and provoke surrender. They issued ultimatums that framed their mission as the restoration of law and order. Yet their underlying motive was unmistakable: to violently suppress the political influence of black citizens and reassert a racial hierarchy disrupted by Reconstruction legislation. The defenders, guided by Ward's experience and leadership, refused to submit. Their defiance was deliberate, measured, and courageous, a testament to the resolve that had been cultivated over days of preparation and shared purpose. Yet the imbalance of numbers and firepower foreshadowed the catastrophic events that were about to unfold. By mid-morning, the tension erupted into violent confrontation. A rapid escalation that transformed the standoff into a massacre, the kind of sudden, unrestrained violence that would shock the nation and leave scars on a community and a country still healing from the Civil War. The first shots rang out, and chaos enveloped the courthouse and its surroundings as smoke, fire, and terror converged into an overwhelming maelstrom. The defenders, though disciplined and determined, faced an enemy that was both numerically superior and ruthlessly committed to eliminating any challenge to white supremacy. Even as some black men attempted to surrender, raising white flags and pleading for mercy, the attackers continued their assault, demonstrating the extent to which racial hatred and the desire for domination had eclipsed any sense of justice or restraint. Inside the courthouse, the scene quickly deteriorated into a nightmarish struggle for survival. Flames consumed the wooden structure, thick smoke filling the rooms and hallways, forcing defenders to make agonizing choices between facing certain death within the building or risking exposure to the militia waiting outside. The heat, smoke, and relentless gunfire created a suffocating environment in which rational decisions were clouded by panic, fear, and desperation. Many tried to escape, seeking refuge in the surrounding woods, but the militias pursued them with a cold and calculated determination, hunting down individuals in a display of merciless violence that underscored the lethal consequences of asserting political rights in a society unwilling to accept them. Eyewitness accounts from survivors, which would later be pieced together through oral histories and written testimonies, recount scenes of unimaginable brutality, men executed after surrendering, bodies left exposed as warnings to others, and the once symbolic courthouse reduced to smoldering ruins. The massacre was not a spontaneous outbreak of violence, but the result of deliberate planning and intent, a grim illustration of how deeply entrenched racial and political animosities could manifest in catastrophic loss of life. Between 60 and 150 black men lost their lives that day, the precise number remaining uncertain due to the deliberate obfuscation and erasure of records. Yet the human cost of the event was undeniable. Affecting families, communities, and the broader trajectory of Reconstruction-era politics, the impact of the Colfax Massacre extended far beyond the immediate violence. For the families left behind, the emotional and social consequences were profound. Widows mourned husbands, children grew up without fathers, and entire communities grappled with the trauma of having witnessed the systemic attempt to suppress their political agency. The courthouse, once a center of civic life and symbol of emerging equality, was reduced to ashes, its destruction serving as a haunting testament to the lengths to which white supremacists would go to maintain social and political dominance. The massacre also exposed the limitations of federal enforcement and the fragility of civil rights protections, as legal mechanisms proved insufficient to hold perpetrators accountable in the face of entrenched local and state resistance. Despite the immediate horror and long-term consequences, the bravery of the courthouse defenders became a powerful emblem of resilience and moral courage, illustrating the willingness of black citizens to confront systemic oppression and defend their rights even under the most extreme circumstances. The events of April 13, 1873, would later serve as a cautionary tale, a historical touchstone demonstrating how fragile democracy can be when confronted with organized violence and entrenched prejudice, and underscoring the importance of vigilance, advocacy, and the ongoing struggle for justice. The Colfax Massacre remains a stark reminder that progress is neither inevitable nor guaranteed, and that the defense of equality often requires extraordinary courage in the face of relentless opposition. The aftermath of the Colfax Massacre left a scene so harrowing that it seemed almost impossible to fully comprehend, a vivid and painful reminder of the brutal realities of Reconstruction-era Louisiana, where racial animosity, political tension, and unchecked violence converged in catastrophic ways. Estimates of those killed range from 60 to as many as 150 black men, though the exact numbers remain uncertain due to the deliberate erasure of records and the chaos that followed the attack. Yet even these estimates are enough to convey the scale of the tragedy and the profound loss experienced by families and communities who had placed their faith in the promise of equality and political participation. Survivors emerged from the ruins and the surrounding woods carrying the physical and emotional scars of a day marked by incomprehensible violence. Their stories filled with accounts of men being hunted down even after surrendering, of executions carried out with cold precision, and of the raw terror of seeing neighbors, friends, and family members struck down in a matter of moments, all underscoring the profound human cost of asserting rights in a society unwilling to accept them. Those who survived the massacre faced challenges that went far beyond immediate survival. Many were pursued through swamps and forests, confronted by attackers who acted with near impunity, knowing that local authorities were either sympathetic to their cause or too intimidated to intervene, and that federal enforcement mechanisms were slow, limited, or effectively neutralized by local resistance. The psychological toll on the survivors was immense. The knowledge that one had narrowly escaped death while so many others had not weighed heavily, shaping communities in ways that were felt for generations, influencing not only personal lives but also the political and social dynamics of the region. As fear and trauma became intertwined with the broader struggle for civil rights and political representation, families of those killed were plunged into mourning, their grief compounded by the lack of justice and accountability that followed the events. Widows faced the dual burden of emotional loss and economic hardship, as the men who had been heads of households were suddenly gone, leaving families without support, guidance, or protection. Children were left fatherless, growing up with stories of violence, resilience, and loss that would inform their understanding of society and the risks inherent in standing up for justice. Communities that had once gathered around the courthouse as a symbol of collective progress now found themselves grappling with the destruction of that symbol. The ashes of the building serving as a stark and haunting reminder of both the courage of those who had defended it and the overwhelming force used to suppress them. The perpetrators of the massacre, largely members of white supremacist militias composed of ex-Confederates and other individuals determined to maintain the antebellum social hierarchy, acted with a calculated confidence born from a sense of impunity, aware that their actions were unlikely to be met with meaningful legal consequences. They understood that local law enforcement, often complicit or sympathetic to their cause, would provide little resistance, and that federal authorities were limited in both reach and willingness to enforce civil rights protections effectively. This environment of near-total impunity not only emboldened the attackers, but also sent a chilling message to other black citizens throughout Louisiana and the South. Political participation and assertion of rights could provoke lethal retaliation, and the enforcement of equality was far from guaranteed in a landscape dominated by those determined to resist it. Eyewitness accounts and survivor testimonies paint a picture of extraordinary courage in the face of overwhelming danger. Yet they also reveal the depths of cruelty to which the attackers were willing to go. Men were shot while attempting to flee, executed after surrendering, and left exposed in public spaces as warnings to those who might follow in their footsteps. Families and neighbors bore witness to scenes that would scar them forever, and these accounts, preserved through oral histories and later recorded in written narratives, provide a window into the profound brutality and systemic oppression that defined the event. Each story is a testament to the human cost of fighting for equality in a society resistant to change and a reminder of the sacrifices made by ordinary citizens committed to justice. The Colfax Massacre also exposed the limitations of legal and political systems at the time. Despite the clear evidence of deliberate and organized violence, federal attempts to hold perpetrators accountable were met with obstacles, including narrow interpretations of constitutional authority and the reluctance or outright refusal of courts to prosecute white supremacist actors. This failure to secure justice reinforced the attackers' sense of invulnerability and contributed to the broader pattern of racial violence that persisted in the post-Reconstruction South, highlighting the fragility of civil rights protections and the urgent need for vigilance and advocacy. The massacre became a symbol of both the possibilities and the perils of asserting political power in an era when equality was promised in law but denied in practice. A stark lesson in how progress can be met with violent resistance and how courage often comes with a high price. For the Black community, the massacre was both a tragedy and a rallying point, a painful reminder of the costs of freedom and the dangers inherent in defending political rights, yet also a testament to resilience, unity, and determination in the face of oppression. Survivors carried forward the memory of those who had fallen, passing down stories of bravery and sacrifice that would inform generations about the stakes of civic engagement and the importance of standing against injustice. The Colfax Massacre stands not only as a historical event but also as an enduring lesson about the consequences of racial hatred, the vulnerability of civil rights when met with violent opposition, and the courage required to defend those rights even when the odds are overwhelmingly against you. Through the lens of this tragedy, we are reminded that justice is neither automatic nor guaranteed, that the assertion of rights can provoke dangerous backlash, and that the preservation of equality requires both collective vigilance and individual courage. The events of April 13, 1873, are a somber chapter in American history, yet they also serve as a powerful testament to human resilience and the enduring struggle for justice, providing lessons that resonate far beyond the borders of Colfax, Louisiana, and continue to inform our understanding of democracy, civil rights, and the moral imperatives of defending equality in the face of overwhelming adversity. In the wake of the Colfax Massacre, the nation faced the stark reality that legal frameworks and promises of civil protection often faltered when confronted with entrenched racial violence. A sobering truth that became painfully evident in the federal response to the tragedy and its aftermath. Despite the existence of the Enforcement Acts, which had been designed to empower federal authorities to prosecute individuals who violated the civil rights of Black citizens, these mechanisms proved inadequate when applied to the orchestrated violence of white supremacist militias. As local and state resistance, judicial interpretation, and political fatigue combined to undermine the pursuit of justice, leaving survivors and communities to grapple with both profound grief and the bitter understanding that the rule of law could fail when those in power were unwilling to enforce it. Federal officials initially attempted to use the Enforcement Acts to bring perpetrators to account, indicting several members of the White League and other militias involved in the massacre, arguing that the coordinated violence represented a deliberate attempt to suppress Black political power through terror, intimidation, and murder. These prosecutions, however, faced significant obstacles from the outset. Judges sympathetic to the South's prevailing social hierarchies, narrow interpretations of constitutional authority, and systemic biases within the legal system all contributed to the slow erosion of the federal government's ability to secure meaningful convictions. And the very mechanisms intended to protect citizens' rights instead became entangled in a web of legal technicalities and political reluctance. The turning point came with the United States v. Cruikshank decision in 1876, a landmark Supreme Court case that would have devastating implications for civil rights enforcement in the post-Reconstruction South, in overturning the convictions of individuals involved in the Colfax Massacre. The court asserted that the federal government lacked the authority to prosecute private actors for civil rights violations unless the state itself had acted to deny those rights, effectively narrowing the scope of the 14th Amendment to actions taken by state governments, while leaving individuals who committed racially motivated violence largely unaccountable. This interpretation, while legally framed as a matter of constitutional boundaries, carried profound social consequences, signaling to white supremacist groups across the South that they could engage in acts of terror with minimal fear of federal intervention or legal reprisal, and reinforcing the systemic barriers that had long prevented Black Americans from exercising the full measure of their rights. For the survivors of Colfax and the broader Black community, the ruling was devastating, compounding the trauma of the massacre itself with the bitter recognition that justice, at least in the legal sense, had been denied, families mourning the loss of husbands, fathers, brothers, and friends had to confront the reality that those responsible for the organized slaughter of their loved ones would likely never face accountability, and that the institutions intended to protect citizens from such violence were either unwilling or unable to do so. This failure reverberated far beyond Grant Parish, sending ripples of fear and caution throughout Louisiana and neighboring states. As Black citizens and their allies realized that asserting political rights and defending communities against violence could provoke lethal retaliation without the guarantee of redress or protection. The broader political and social implications of the ruling were equally significant. It emboldened white supremacist organizations such as the White League and the Ku Klux Klan, affirming their belief that coordinated terror could be used as a tool to suppress Black political influence without consequence, and intensifying efforts to intimidate and disenfranchise Black citizens across the South. The United States Cruikshank decision, in effect, signaled a retreat from Reconstruction-era commitments to civil rights enforcement, illustrating how legal interpretations and judicial decisions could reinforce social hierarchies and perpetuate systemic oppression even in the face of clear evidence of violent wrongdoing. At the same time, the ruling highlighted the precariousness of progress during Reconstruction, revealing that the enactment of amendments and legislation, while monumental on paper, depended entirely on the willingness and ability of institutions to enforce them, and that rights could be rendered meaningless when the mechanisms of justice were undermined by political will, prejudice, or institutional weakness. The massacre itself, coupled with the legal outcome, underscored the fragility of Black political gains in Louisiana and across the South, reminding citizens that freedom and representation were hard-won and could be violently contested or revoked by those unwilling to accept equality. Yet amidst the despair and injustice, the narrative of Colfax and the rulings that followed also became a touchstone for future civil rights advocacy, a stark example of both the consequences of legal and institutional inaction and the necessity of persistent vigilance, activism, and reform. The events compelled Black communities and allies to recognize that achieving and maintaining civil rights required not only legal codification but also active enforcement, collective organization, and the cultivation of public awareness to counter systemic violence and institutional neglect. The massacre and the United States Cruikshank decision thus became intertwined in the American memory as emblematic of the failures of Reconstruction, illustrating the perils of relying on legal authority alone to safeguard equality in a society still deeply divided by race, power, and the legacy of slavery. In reflecting on this chapter of history, it becomes clear that the Colfax Massacre and its aftermath were not merely isolated incidents of violence but pivotal moments that exposed the limitations of federal authority, the enduring strength of white supremacist networks, and the vulnerability of a population striving for political participation in a hostile environment. The lessons from these events remain relevant, emphasizing the importance of accountability, the dangers of impunity, and the ongoing struggle to ensure that legal protections translate into real-world security and justice for all citizens. The story of Colfax is a somber reminder that the promise of equality is not self-executing, and that the pursuit of justice requires courage, persistence, and unwavering commitment in the face of entrenched opposition, lessons that continue to resonate across generations and inform contemporary discussions about civil rights. systemic inequality, and the enduring challenge of building a truly equitable society. In the wake of the Colfax Massacre and the crushing legal defeat that followed with the United States v. Cruikshank decision, the human cost of the events extended far beyond the immediate horror of that April day, embedding itself into the very fabric of communities across Grant Parish and the wider South, where families were left to grapple with the sudden and irreversible absence of fathers, husbands, brothers, and sons, their loss leaving emotional and economic voids that would shape lives for generations, while survivors and witnesses carried the psychological scars of a violence that was deliberate, targeted, and almost incomprehensible in its cruelty. The massacre not only extinguished lives, but also dismantled the sense of security and community that Black citizens had been striving to establish during the fleeting hopes of Reconstruction, leaving neighborhoods bereft of leaders, protectors, and mentors who had fought tirelessly to claim their rightful place in the political and social order, and thrusting widows and children into uncertainty, poverty, and an environment where fear and grief became daily companions. In these communities, the shock of sudden bereavement merged with the harsh reality of systemic oppression, as the failure of justice, both through local inaction and federal impotence, demonstrated the extent to which institutional structures could be wielded to maintain racial hierarchies rather than to protect citizens. And the Colfax Massacre became a grim precedent, a clear signal that violence against Black political participation could be executed with impunity, and that the legal system might offer little recourse when faced with coordinated acts of racial terror. Families who had hoped that Reconstruction would bring security, opportunity, and political empowerment were confronted with the brutal fact that entrenched white supremacy would not simply be negotiated or legislated away, and that the social order they were challenging was willing to employ any means necessary to reassert dominance, from intimidation and economic pressure to lethal force. This environment of terror and instability paved the way for the formalization of racial oppression in the decades that followed. Jim Crow law, which institutionalized segregation and curtailed the civil liberties of Black Americans, found fertile ground in the aftermath of Reconstruction's collapse, codifying inequality in education, transportation, public spaces, and legal access, and entrenching social hierarchies that had been violently defended during events such as the Colfax Massacre, coupled with systematic voter suppression tactics including literacy tests, poll taxes, and intimidation at the polls. The legacy of Colfax illustrated how the violent suppression of political engagement could be reinforced through law and policy, creating a multi-generational impact that would marginalize entire communities and ensure that the voices and agency of Black citizens were constrained for decades. The massacre also reverberated culturally and psychologically, as narratives were manipulated to obscure the reality of what had occurred, framing the event as a riot or mutual conflict in order to downplay the organized, racially targeted nature of the violence and to shift blame onto Black defenders, further intensifying the marginalization of survivors and erasing their suffering from public memory. This deliberate misrepresentation of history contributed to a societal understanding that minimized the human cost of white supremacist aggression, while simultaneously reinforcing the notion that Black citizens' pursuit of equality was both dangerous and illegitimate, creating an environment in which fear and caution became necessary survival tools, and where the courage required to defend rights was met with near constant threat of death or social ostracization. Generations of families experienced the cascading effects of these dynamics, as children who grew up fatherless and communities stripped of their political leaders internalized lessons of caution, vigilance, and resistance, often finding ways to cultivate resilience and solidarity in the face of systemic injustice. The massacre and its aftermath underscored the fragility of progress during Reconstruction, illustrating that political rights gained on paper could be violently contested in practice. and that the fight for representation and equality required not only courage but also the constant navigation of systemic barriers reinforced by both formal law and informal violence. The memories of those lost in Colfax became interwoven with broader narratives of resilience, as communities adapted to survive and preserve cultural, social, and political identities despite the oppressive forces arrayed against them, ensuring that the stories of those who had fought and perished were not forgotten entirely. At the societal level, the massacre foreshadowed the entrenchment of racialized hierarchies and the widespread disenfranchisement that would characterize much of the post-Reconstruction South. The legal precedent set by cases like United States v. Cruikshank created an enduring environment in which white supremacist groups could operate with confidence, further marginalizing black citizens and consolidating power structures that favored systemic oppression over justice, while simultaneously sending a message to the nation that the protection of civil rights required more than legislation, it demanded enforcement, vigilance, and the collective insistence that equality would be defended against all forms of subversion. The long-term consequences for families and communities were profound, as the loss of fathers and husbands left women to manage households under extreme duress. Children were deprived of mentors and protectors, and communities were forced to navigate an increasingly hostile social and legal landscape that sought to curtail the freedoms for which so many had fought and suffered. Yet even amidst these challenges, the memory of Colfax served as a source of moral instruction and historical awareness, reminding subsequent generations of the costs of injustice, the fragility of civil liberties when confronted by entrenched hatred, and the enduring necessity of courage, solidarity, and advocacy in the ongoing pursuit of equity. The story of Colfax is therefore not merely one of tragedy, but also a profound illustration of resilience in the face of systemic oppression, showing how families, communities, and individuals endured unimaginable hardship, resisted erasure, and preserved the memory of those who had been lost, passing forward lessons about the importance of justice, vigilance, and the unwavering pursuit of equality, lessons that continue to resonate today as society reckons with the legacies of violence, disenfranchisement, and racial oppression, and as the struggle for civil rights and social equity remains an urgent, living endeavor. For decades after the Colfax Massacre, the story of that horrific day in Grant Parish was shrouded in silence, its brutality obscured and its victims rendered almost invisible in the broader narrative of American history. As local governments, educational systems, and cultural institutions conspired, whether intentionally or through neglect, to recast the massacre in terms that minimized its significance, labeling it as a riot and framing it as a mutual conflict rather than the calculated, racially motivated slaughter it truly was, a distortion that allowed generations to remain unaware of the depth of violence that had been inflicted upon black citizens striving for political equality and social recognition during the fragile Reconstruction era. By diminishing the events and rewriting the narrative, those in positions of authority effectively erased the courage and humanity of the defenders of the Colfax courthouse, while simultaneously normalizing the idea that white supremacists could be treated as a regrettable but ultimately understandable outcome of social tension. A framing that served to perpetuate existing hierarchies and validate a racial status quo that had been violently enforced in 1873 and continued to shape social dynamics long after Reconstruction officially ended. This erasure extended deeply into the education system, where textbooks and curricula either omitted the Colfax Massacre entirely or relegated it to a footnote, presenting it as a chaotic, unavoidable confrontation rather than a deliberate attack on newly enfranchised black citizens. And as a result, young learners in Louisiana and beyond were denied a critical understanding of the realities of post-Civil War America, including the systemic violence, organized intimidation, and legal failures that characterized the period. In the absence of formal acknowledgement, Families and communities were left to grapple with memories of loss and injustice without the reinforcement of historical recognition, passing down stories in hushed tones or through oral tradition. A powerful but fragile method of preserving memory that often competed with the dominant narratives propagated by local and state authorities seeking to sanitize the past. It was not until the surge of the civil rights movement in the 1960s and 1970s that the truth of Colfax began to re-emerge in public consciousness. As scholars, activists, and journalists embarked on dedicated efforts to uncover the realities of Reconstruction-era racial violence, challenge misleading historical interpretations, and memorialize the victims whose lives had been brutally taken. These efforts included painstaking archival research, interviews with descendants of survivors, and the compilation of contemporaneous accounts that had long been overlooked, ignored, or intentionally suppressed, revealing not only the sheer scale of the massacre, but also the broader social and political forces that had enabled it. Through these rediscovery efforts, historians and civil rights advocates worked to reconstruct a narrative that restored agency and dignity to Black citizens who had fought to defend their political rights, positioning the Colfax Massacre not as an isolated anomaly, but as a reflection of systemic opposition to racial equality and a cautionary tale about the fragility of democracy in the face of entrenched prejudice. The rediscovery of Colfax's history also coincided with broader campaigns to confront historical injustice and challenge prevailing narratives that had long marginalized Black experiences, as activists recognized that understanding the past, its violence, its failures of justice, and its consequences was essential to addressing ongoing inequality and informing contemporary struggles for civil rights. By bringing attention to Colfax, the movement highlighted the continuity of systemic oppression, illustrating that patterns of disenfranchisement, intimidation, and social marginalization were not confined to a distant past, but were part of a longer trajectory that required acknowledgement and active resistance. Public commemorations, memorials, and educational initiatives emerged during this period, gradually reclaiming the story from decades of erasure and ensuring that the massacre and its victims could not be so easily forgotten. These efforts sought not only to honor the fallen, but also to educate a broader public about the dangers of historical denial, the consequences of unchecked violence, and the importance of vigilance in safeguarding civil rights. Despite these strides, the journey toward recognition and understanding was fraught with resistance, as some sectors of society viewed acknowledgement of Colfax as an affront to local heritage or an unwelcome challenge to long-held cultural narratives, illustrating the ongoing tension between memory, history, and social identity, and the way in which historical events can be contested, reframed, or denied to serve contemporary purposes. Nevertheless, the work of uncovering the truth continued, aided by emerging technologies, digital archives, and social media, which allowed for broader dissemination of historical research. Survivor testimonies, and critical scholarship that had previously been confined to academic circles, fostering new opportunities for engagement and education. Through this lens, the story of Colfax evolved from a suppressed and misrepresented event into a powerful symbol of both injustice and resilience. A reminder of the costs of racial violence and the importance of confronting uncomfortable truths rather than allowing them to fade into obscurity. The rediscovery of Colfax demonstrates that history is not fixed, but is continually interpreted, contested, and reclaimed, and that the act of remembering can serve as both an ethical obligation and a tool for social transformation. It also underscores the necessity of amplifying marginalized voices and ensuring that narratives of oppression and resistance are preserved with accuracy and integrity, allowing communities to learn from past failures and honor those who bore the burden of systemic violence. By tracing the arc from deliberate erasure to rediscovery, the story of Colfax also reveals broader lessons about the relationship between historical memory and contemporary justice. showing how the legacies of events like the massacre continue to shape social attitudes, inform activism, and influence the struggle for equality and civil rights in the present day. The acknowledgement of this dark chapter challenges viewers to consider the ways in which history is written and remembered, the consequences of silence, and the enduring need to confront the realities of injustice to build a more equitable future, reminding us that forgetting history allows the forces that perpetuate inequality and violence to persist, while remembrance and critical engagement create opportunities for reflection, learning, a meaningful societal change. As we reach the close of this story, it becomes clear that the Colfax Massacre is far more than a historical footnote. It stands as a profound illustration of the fragility of democracy and the costs of leaving justice unprotected. The events of April 13, 1873, remind us that when fear, prejudice, and the desire to maintain power go unchecked, the principles of equality and fairness can be violently undermined, leaving communities devastated and trust in governance shattered. The massacre was not only a catastrophic loss of life, but also a powerful symbol of what can occur when a society allows systemic injustice to fester, and when the rule of law fails to protect its most vulnerable citizens. The lessons of Colfax reach far beyond the boundaries of Grant Parish or the Reconstruction Era, echoing into the present day, urging us to examine how democracy functions, who it serves, and what responsibilities we bear to uphold it in the face of intimidation, inequality, or entrenched societal bias. Colfax exemplifies how fragile political gains can be, especially for communities whose rights have historically been contested or ignored. The bravery of the black citizens who stood at the courthouse, defending not only their elected officials but also their fundamental rights, speaks to the courage required to protect democracy itself, even when facing overwhelming odds. Their actions remind us that progress is neither automatic nor guaranteed. It must be defended with vigilance, solidarity, and, at times, personal sacrifice. At the same time, the massacre illustrates the consequences of societal silence and deliberate erasure, showing how neglecting historical truths can perpetuate cycles of oppression, obscure lessons from the past, and allow injustices to remain unchallenged. By confronting the reality of Colfax, we acknowledge the resilience and dignity of those who resisted, and we recognize the ways in which history shapes the struggles and aspirations of future generations. Understanding Colfax also emphasizes the ongoing struggle for racial equality and civil rights. The massacre's legacy did not end with Reconstruction. It continued to reverberate through the implementation of Jim Crow laws, systemic voter suppression, and the broader cultural and social marginalization of Black Americans for decades. By learning about events like Colfax, we are reminded that the fight for equality is not a distant story, but a continuous effort that demands awareness, education, and active participation. It highlights the responsibility each of us carries to challenge injustice wherever it occurs, to ensure that political and civil rights are protected, and to honor the sacrifices of those who fought for freedoms that many of us may take for granted today. The memory of Colfax urges us to hold accountable systems and institutions that fail to uphold equity and to advocate for structural changes that create a society where fairness, opportunity, and protection under the law are available to all. Moreover, the story of Colfax teaches the importance of historical memory and acknowledgement. By facing uncomfortable truths, we cultivate understanding, empathy, and a commitment to preventing the repetition of such tragedies. Recognizing past injustices allows communities to heal, enables constructive dialogue about the present, and inspires future generations to contribute to a more just and equitable society. The rediscovery of Colfax during the civil rights movement exemplifies how uncovering hidden histories can empower activism, guide legal reform, and foster public awareness that transforms societies. It reminds us that the pursuit of justice is ongoing, requiring persistent effort, engagement, and the courage to confront the dark corners of our shared past. as we reflect on the courage, the loss, and the enduring lessons of the Colfax Massacre. It is important to carry forward the stories of those who perished and those who survived, ensuring that their experiences continue to educate and inspire. Their struggle is a testament to the necessity of protecting democracy, honoring historical truth, and committing to the long and often difficult work of achieving racial equality. We hope that by sharing this story, viewers are encouraged to engage critically with history, appreciate the sacrifices that have shaped the freedoms many enjoy today, and participate actively in nurturing a society that values justice, inclusion, and collective responsibility. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch and learn about this important chapter of American history. If you found this video insightful, please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing it so that more people can understand the lessons of Colfax and the importance of safeguarding equality and democracy. Your engagement helps keep history alive and ensures that the sacrifices of those who fought for justice are never forgotten. From all of us here, we wish you a peaceful night and a restful sleep. Good night, and may the stories of courage and resilience inspire you as you dream and prepare to face the world with awareness, empathy, and commitment to justice.